Well, turning now to Michal Snipes, he's an Associate Professor of Instruction and Economics at the University of South Florida. Michael, voters are always going to be thinking about how a particular candidate might affect their own economic situation. What's different about this election?
Well, I think with this election, we're still facing a lot of economic issues that have been there for quite a while. Affordable housing is one that's been a problem, especially around here, for a very long time. And we're still facing, inflation. Some of the inflation that started in 2020, some of that is still around, especially when it comes to housing and food and all of those things that people really need in order to survive. Those prices are still high. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we're still dealing with a lot of issues that have been around for quite a while.
Now, when you talk about inflation, it has been coming down, right? It was pretty high, spiking to about 9% or something in 2022, and that was sort of on the back of the very start of that pandemic, all the supply chain issues that got turned around there. As of September, it was 2.4%, so a pretty big dip, but do people pay attention to those trends when they're thinking about inflation, or are they just thinking, what is the cost of goods now, and what is inflation looking like right now?
Yeah, I think it's more of a right now type situation, and I think that there's really kind of a lot of maybe misunderstanding as to what exactly the inflation rate is and what it does. I think the best way to describe it is just think of it as like average prices, mm-hmm. right? So, I mean, yes, it is true that the inflation rate is going down, but that doesn't mean that every single price is going down. The price of housing is still well above the average inflation rate. The price of food, both in grocery stores and in restaurants, is still well above the average inflation rate. And so when we look at prices and inflation, yes, it is coming down, but it's not necessarily the types of goods that people really need, right? It's housing isn't really coming down. It's getting a little bit better, but housing's not coming down, food's not coming down. And when it's those types of goods that people really need, they have to have, then really any kind of other inflation, any other kind of prices coming down, that's really not going to have too much of an effect because the prices are coming down on things that they don't necessarily need.
So that 2.4% doesn't really give you a very good picture of what people are thinking about and how they're impacted when they're thinking, what have I got to spend and what do I need to spend it on?
Right. Yeah. It's really more of a snapshot of just where the economy is right now, and that's one of the big problems with trying to use these big metrics to describe the economy, like GDP or unemployment rate or inflation. It's just so much information is crammed into just one number that really trying to kind of piece out exactly what is happening is difficult to do. Mm-hmm. And so when we hear just that one number, we tend to think, okay, 2.1%, prices are starting to stabilize. But that doesn't mean every single price is stabilizing. It just means that on average, prices are stabilizing.
Now, a couple of economic ideas from both presidential candidates stand out. Former President Donald Trump talks about rolling out more tariffs on foreign goods, and Vice President Kamala Harris wants to give first-time home buyers up to $25,000 for a down payment. Those policies sound simple, but are they?
Well, with the tariff one especially, really most of the time when we see tariffs put on, it's to protect kind of domestic industries. That's the argument, right? So we'll put in a tariff and we'll protect against foreign goods coming in, maybe undercutting our prices, and then that will try and stimulate the American economy, right? That's kind of how the argument goes. But it's a pretty well-known result in economics that that's not really what tariffs do. Right? Using tariffs as kind of a protectionist policy a lot of the times backfires. And I think that there is a lot of misperception there that when we say it's a tariff, people tend to think of it, okay, it's a tax on imported goods, which it is. But we are the ones as consumers, we are the ones who are paying the tax. So so if we put a tariff on goods from China, for example, well, it's not like all of a sudden China is paying 10% of the prices. If the tariff was 10%, it wouldn't be. But if it's not really that country that's paying for them, right? Mm-hmm. So if the price of a T-shirt from China is $5, well, that's still going to be the import price. But when we have a tariff, that's when that tax gets put on. So it's an additional cost that we as consumers are going to be paying on imports, and it's not something that's going to be paid by another country. And with respect to with respect to Harris,
on houses.
Right, and the down payments on houses, I think that is something that could help, because that's something that's really kind of trying to address that affordable housing situation. Is really kind of moving towards not necessarily a tax, but really almost kind of more of a subsidy or a transfer payment or something like that.
But wouldn't it just have the impact of driving house prices up then? I mean, wouldn't people say, if I know folks are going to be able to get their hands on some kind of down payment assistance, I'm just going to, put my prices up?
Sure, and there are some programs out there right now that will help with housing. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times it's very difficult for people who receive that aid to find a place where they can live, simply because landlords, they don't take assistance. They don't take government programs or something like that. So I don't necessarily think that argument really holds much weight for a lot of reasons. Part of it is they can't even get a house in the first place because they're on a program. But a lot of the time, there's been a number of studies that have really kind of looked at those government programs. And the economic idea is pretty straightforward, right? You give people more money, they spend it, prices go up. It's a pretty straightforward argument, but there's a lot of empirical research out there that finds that that's just really not the case. Or if it is the case that prices go up, kind of the benefit of the program or the benefit of the subsidy or the transfer payment far outweighs any small increase that we might see in the price of housing. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we can't necessarily ignore the fact that inflation is a possibility, but the benefit far outweighs the cost of any small increase in the price of housing.
I guess there's also the supply issue too, right? I mean, there just isn't a lot of affordable housing, or even housing for folks who may not think, I'm looking for something affordable, I just need something to buy.
Right, and that is starting to change. I live down in Manatee County off of Highway 64, and in just the past 5 years, I mean, we've gone from just acres and acres and acres of old growth to now it's just a concrete jungle. And a lot of that is new apartments, new condos, new duplexes, things like that. So at least around where I am, it is something that is starting to be addressed, but that's not necessarily something that might be possible in a bigger area like St. Petersburg or Tampa because, well, a lot of the area is already developed. Right. There is no place necessarily to put them.
Unless you go up.
Right. And I think that it's really going to be something, especially with affordable housing, it's something that's going to have to be kind of a small area approach, maybe at the county level or something like that. Because, I mean, yes, Tampa and St. Pete are going to have a very different housing market than Manatee County would.
Both presidential candidates also say they want to eliminate tax on tips, but what does this really mean to the money bartenders, servers, and others make, and what impact would that have on the economy in the greater Tampa Bay region?
Yeah, well, it could have a huge impact on servers. But at least my understanding of the two proposals is that they're very different. So with Harris's proposal, it's really going to be mostly contained to restaurant and service industries, things like this. But with Trump's proposal, we could maybe consider commissions a tip. Mm-hmm. Well, if we consider commissions a tip, that's really just kind of a backdoor way of giving tax cuts to wealthier individuals or investors. And that's not really who really, quite frankly, needs the help. It's lower income individuals. It's the people who are working two jobs, maybe working as a server in a minimum wage job. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, yes, they would cut taxes on tips, but really kind of what constitutes a tip, that's going to be something that could be very different. And in terms of the economy, I mean, I don't really think that it would have too much of an impact on the economy overall. It's really more of a micro-focused proposal. It's about helping individuals as opposed to trying to stimulate the economy.
When we look at economic concerns for voters in the Tampa Bay area, some people who filled out WUSF's online survey, this is not a scientific survey, but they said they were worried about home insurance, income inequality, affordable housing, which we've talked about. But when you think about some of those other things, what impact could a presidential candidate have on some of those things?
With income inequality, that's definitely something that, at least in my opinion, is going to have to be sorted by the government, because I don't think that a market, a free market, a capitalist market is something that's really going to address inequality. And there's been a lot of theories and a lot of ideas out there that say that inequality really just comes out because of a capitalist system. And so when we look at how we can address inequality, again, I think it's going to have to come from some sort of government provision, government policy.
And that could be either federal or state.
Could be federal, could be state, could be any number of ways. And so I think what we're looking for is really more of a political will than an economic will. Because there are programs out there like cutting taxes on servers and restricting it to the hospitality industry. There are ideas out there that could help lower income individuals or struggling families, but it really comes down to, is there a political will to do so? And I think that, if Trump happens to win or if Harris happens to win, what exactly is going to be their motivation to help the country, of course, and then help lower income or struggling families? It's going to be very different approaches.
Mm-hmm. And something like homeowners insurance, I mean, the state of Florida has had multiple attempts to try and fix whatever issues we have going on with homeowners insurance here in Florida. But do you see a president having some kind of marked influence on the situation there?
Yeah, but when it comes to insurance markets, those are really going to be more state-specific than anything else. I mean, there are things that the federal government could try to do, but really because those are more state-specific policies, I think that you would get a lot of pushback from a lot of states saying that this is some sort of federal incursion or something like this. Mm-hmm. But it is something that would, again, it's going to have to come back down to the state level. And is whoever is governor, is this going to be something that they choose to seriously address?
Right. The economy has an impact on the election. I'm wondering, though, do the results of elections also influence consumer confidence? Does it kind of go back the other way?
Yeah. So kind of depending upon who's leading in the polls, that has an effect on the stock market. If we have somebody who's more maybe pro-market, kind of keeping the government out, then the stock market reflects that. So, I mean, anytime that we go into any kind of uncertain situation like a presidential election, there's going to be some uncertainty in the markets, whether it be the stock markets or just regular everyday goods markets. There's going to be some churn there a little bit just because there is uncertainty. We're not exactly sure what this person's going to do. But most of the time, markets, when it comes to that kind of shock, they can stabilize pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. Because once we know who's there and how it's going to run, then we can kind of adjust our behavior.
Right. How big a factor do you think the recent hurricanes could have on the Tampa Bay economy, and do you see that influencing the way voters think about this election?
Yeah. Well, I don't think the hurricanes would necessarily inform how they would vote on an election. But it could definitely have an impact on the economy because, somebody who lives out of state, they've now seen that we had 2 major hurricanes in 3 weeks. Maybe I'm going to start to think twice. And tourism is such a huge part of our economy here in Florida. It's, by far the biggest part of our economy, that if we can get enough people to say that I'm going to give a second thought to going to Florida, I don't really want to get hit in these hurricanes, that could be something that could deter people coming in. Mm-hmm. But it does kind of tie into the housing thing that we were talking a little bit earlier, too. And one thing that we see time and time again is that when a hurricane comes through and kind of wipes out an area, maybe a week later, maybe even a couple of days later, what you see is some of these big corporate housing conglomerates come in and they'll move in and they'll try and buy distressed properties at a discounted price, right? It was just knocked down by a hurricane. Who's going to want this? They go in and they buy housing at a very reasonable price. And what that does is that takes housing off the market. And that's something that is really a big problem in Florida, but nationwide, is that we have these companies that go out and buy these distressed properties, buy these cheap properties, and they use them to rent. And again, that takes housing off the market, drives prices up. And if they can't find somebody to rent it, then that's really just empty housing. We have more empty houses here in the United States, or just housing in general. We have more empty houses here in the United States than we do homeless individuals or people who are, struggling to afford rent. I mean, there's a mismatch there. I mean, if we say that, we believe in the markets to solve these problems, that's a huge mismatch. When we've got millions of unoccupied homes and we've got people struggling to find affordable housing, that's a huge mismatch that the market's not going to correct. It's something that's going to have to come from some sort of centralized government.
Yeah. There's an economic component to a lot of issues that voters bring up around election time. Immigration, for example, has an impact on Florida's economy. You can't talk about reproductive rights without talking about access to healthcare and what that costs. Is every election at the end just an economic question?
For some people, definitely. For some people, that's going to be their number one thing is, what are you going to do with taxes? What are you going to do to try and stimulate the economy? But I think for most people, really, I think most people are going to be voting more on social issues than economic issues. And certainly, I'm not downplaying the economic issues that we have with inflation, with food prices being high, with housing being high. There are still major problems out there that are economic. But I think what guides a lot of people's voting behavior is not necessarily economically driven. A lot of it's going to be kind of more socially driven, social issues driving it.
I find it interesting you say that because there's been a lot of polls around this election, like the Pew Research Center, for example, publishing a poll in September that revealed 8 in 10 registered voters say the economy will be very important to the vote in the presidential election. Right.
And yeah, like I said, I didn't mean to discount that. That is a huge issue, and that is going to be the leading issue for a lot of people. But again, it comes down to, at least from an economic policy perspective, a lot of people are going to be saying, what are you going to be doing for me? And that's, I've seen a lot of push in the recent weeks of Harris on television saying, I am going to be working for you, trying to put that message across, getting people who were Republican to now come out for her, in favor of her. So it's really...
And on the other side of the ledge, you have Donald Trump saying, I will end inflation.
Sure, right.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I've seen coming out of the Trump campaign has really been kind of more focused on social issues, right? Not necessarily economic issues. But yeah, if he does come out and say, I'm going to put a stop to inflation, well, how are you going to do that? And I think that that's something that is really kind of lacking coming out of the Trump campaign. And Harris has done a little bit better, but it's really kind of difficult to say what the specifics are going to be. Well, because you have only so much time, you have to go through the processes of getting these things passed. But it really just kind of comes down to, who do you think that once we elect this president, who do you think they're going to be looking out for? Are they going to be looking out for the market or the economy, or are they going to be looking out for me as an individual? Right? So when we look at, are we going to be looking at trying to help the economy, right, or help growth or things like that? Well, there are a lot of ways that you can grow the economy that really aren't going to help the average person. You can increase government spending. That's not going to necessarily help the average person. We can cut taxes on returns from investment. That's not going to help lower income individuals, but they would help the economy. So when you're thinking about how people are going to be voting on economic issues, are we looking at trying to just stimulate the economy, or are we looking at more trying to help individuals?
We've been speaking with Michal Snipes. He's an associate professor of instruction and economics at the University of South Florida. Michael, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.